Okay, hello guys, welcome back. So we are now getting into 1962 and the real point of crisis in this Cold War. So make sure you understand the context for this situation, that is the Cuban Revolution and the Bay of Pigs, and now we're at the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so since the 1950s, the US had stationed missiles in Eastern Europe, most notably Turkey and Italy. This meant that the USA had the ability to launch a nuclear attack on Moscow or any Soviet city at any time, which gives them, if you remember, that second strike capability. Even if if the USSR destroyed America with nuclear weapons, they have the ability to send weapons back to Russia and the USSR from their bases. Now I'm actually sitting in front of quite a cool map that I found, if I move out the way, where we've got the rings of where the missiles can reach from 3 bases. Now you've got one in the UK, one in Italy, and one in Turkey. The red one is in Turkey. And you can see the expanse of the world which is covered within those circles. So they are the US missile bases at that point in Europe. So they have a very strong dominant presence in Europe. Now, Soviets don't have a similar location near the USA. They don't have the power to hit the USA with missiles. They can just about hit Alaska, but they can't get to mainland America. Now that Cuba has become communist and aligned itself to the Soviet Union, that is about to change, because clearly Khrushchev is thinking in his head, well, finally we have somewhere really close to America, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, where we could place missiles. Now those missiles would be highly threatening to America in terms of, and really boost our presence in this Cold War. Now at this point in the war, Cuba's relationship with the USSR has massively strengthened. Now here's a picture of them shaking hands with each other, and I'm going to get to this one in a moment. But for the moment, I just want to talk about reasons why this relationship has grown closer. So first of all, we've got the obvious ideological reasons. Cuba is now communist, as is the USSR. The USSR often wishes to have relationships and perhaps a level of control over other countries that follow communism. There is a difference though. In Cuba, communism is kind of a basis, and there's much less focus on Marxism, the real priority being improving lifestyle. Whereas in the USSR, for Khrushchev, for Stalin before him, Marxism, communism is kind of, the entire point of the revolution. This means that actually one of the big factors in pushing Castro into Khrushchev and pushing Cuba to the USSR is actually their poor relationship with America, especially after the Bay of Pigs incident. So for Khrushchev, he likewise wants to use Castro to kind of help him. So for him, having this close ally near America was an opportunity to seize, for him to seize and to help him increase Soviet influence in South America. At present, the Soviet Union, as I said, could hit Alaska with nuclear missiles, but not the mainland United States. And that brings me to this cartoon picture. Now, I'm not going to go into this in a huge amount of detail because we don't really know what happens yet, but basically we can see Khrushchev is a dentist and he's pulling the teeth from Castro. Now, these teeth are the missiles which he is about to place on Cuba. And even without understanding a huge amount about what happens yet in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we can see the power play here, that Khrushchev is manipulating and using Cuba and Castro to kind of have his own means here, to get his own way, to do things that benefit the USSR and not necessarily to benefit Cuba itself. So the first nuclear warheads are transported to the island of Cuba in the summer of 1962. But it's not until October that the USA realized what was going on. An American U-2 spy plane, the same kind of plane that was the one that got shot down with Gary Powers in it over the Soviet Union a while back, if you remember, takes these aerial photographs of a number of sites in Cuba that clearly contain nuclear missiles. There's evidence of medium range and intercontinental intermediate range ballistic missiles. Now, the Soviets have built 9 sites, 6 for the medium range ones and 3 for the intermediate range missiles. These missiles have a maximum range of 4,500 kilometers. Now, remember that Florida is sitting 90 miles off the coast. So that distance they now have shows they're able to hit pretty much any American city. If I just move slightly, you can see the aerial image behind me with the labels obviously showing where these sites were located. So what are America going to do about this? They've realized that they have nuclear missile bases within range of all American cities. What are they going to do? After a week of discussions with his advisors, a committee known as XCOM that Kennedy uses to kind of seek advice from, he makes a speech to the American people. He reveals the existence of the missiles. He announces that no ships from any country would be allowed to visit Cuba. And this is what we call a blockade. The US blocked all transport in of any good to Cuba and ordered the US Navy boats to fire on any ship that tries to get past it. Now, if you remember, this is almost identical to what happens in Berlin when Stalin does the same thing to the West, when Stalin blockades Berlin in 1948 and stops all food and fuel getting into the country. So Kennedy orders essentially the same thing. There's a source picture behind me. I'm going to move out of the way, a propaganda image of, you can see the American man holding on to Cuba with his claws. Now, I think what's really interesting is there's a very, very similar picture of the Soviet bear enclosing and encompassing Berlin as a propaganda picture for the Berlin blockade. But basically, Kennedy orders a blockade of Cuba. So nothing is allowed to get into Cuba. And I guess the point here is that it stops the bringing in of more missiles, Soviet missiles, into Cuba, and any armed or nuclear or, weapons, soldiers, army, things like that. It prevents all of that from getting in. Kennedy warns that anybody who breaks the quarantine was going to face serious consequences, including military action. So Kennedy is said to have reported to have said to his brother at the time that this was one hell of a gamble. It's a clear line that he sets. If the Soviets crossed it, America would have to go to war. They've threatened it. It would look incredibly weak if they now back off. So they essentially get themselves ready. They announce that we're on a level of DEFCON 3. Now, this is a leveling system, a system to describe the level of readiness of the armed forces for defense. DEFCON 5 meant forces are at normal readiness, so nothing out of the ordinary is happening. They're ready as they would normally be. And DEFCON 1 means that nuclear war is imminent. So we're at DEFCON 3, that's announced. It's the riskiest point of the Cold War. And because Kennedy has announced it to the public start flocking to the streets and protesting, calling for Kennedy to show restraint and avoid war. Everyone is holding their breath and watching what's going to happen next. I thought would be really interesting is just very quickly, this poster behind me goes through some of the statistics about the blockade of Cuba. Now, I mentioned in an earlier video on this that this is actually the longest standing piece of foreign policy that America have ever had, and that the blockade is still going on today. And it tells us here about the economic impacts on both Cuba and America for doing this. So Cuba have lost essentially $1 trillion through this blockade. And America is losing between 1.2 and 3.6 billion dollars a year. Every year this continues. That's through, loss of trade, things like that. At the bottom here as well, 188 countries are opposed to this blockade, which shows us, I guess, the kind of iron will of America, their refusal to back down here, but also that commitment to not engage with communism, and really the strength of that opinion from America. Right, now is the moment where things start to get incredibly tense. So the Americans have blockaded Cuba. Boats are surrounding Cuba, forming a ring, preventing anything from going inside. And they've been given the go-ahead to fire on anything that tries. Castro orders Cuban forces to be ready to fight. He's worried that the Americans are going to invade Cuba. On the 23rd of October, 1962, Soviet ships approach Cuba carrying missiles. Now, this is where we enter a game of brinkmanship, and you need to remember that key term that we learned when we looked at the arms race. Brinkmanship, pushing things to the brink, pushing them to the edge of the risk, okay? Who is going to be the one that backs down? On the 24th of October, UN Secretary General called for a compromise, and Khrushchev ordered his ships to halt, but not turn back. So Khrushchev's boats with the missiles on have gone up to the blockade. They've then halted, but they haven't turned around. Tensions are incredibly high, and a move from either boat can prove fatal. So yet again, we're seeing another situation similar to Checkpoint Charlie, where, you know, if one side makes a wrong move, if one side makes an accidental move, the whole thing could just explode, and war could have happened. So we enter a period of time which is often called the 13 days, and that includes the 23rd, 24th of October that I've just spoken about. Now, this is the moment where the Cold War, as I've said, reaches its highest point of tension. So 24th of October, I just explained, the boats have been paused at the blockade. Now, the 25th of October, we enter the brink of war. So what happens is this. 7:15 a.m., 25th of October, a Soviet ship enters the quarantine zone. It's stopped by US ships, but when it becomes clear it's just an oil tanker, it's allowed to pass. However, it went through the blockade. Technically, the US could have fired upon it. That would have caused war. Right, one day later, the 26th of October, another hugely tense day. So Kennedy assembles ExCom the next morning and discusses the invasion of Cuba. And over 120,000 troops are assembled in Florida ready to invade. On the same day, a letter arrives from Khrushchev. This letter promises the Soviet Union would withdraw the missiles from Cuba if the Americans promised not to invade. And on the surface, it appears that Khrushchev has backed down. So 26th of October ends in a positive for America. However, the next day, 27th of October, a number of things happen which could each one of them have triggered war. US ship Randolph is sailing in the water, and it detects a Soviet B-59 submarine close to Cuba. Now, remember when we did the arms race, we learned that both sides developed the technology to have these underwater submarines in undetected locations where they can fire nuclear weapons from. So a US ship detects presence of one of these submarines near Cuba. It tries to get the submarine to surface by sending electrical currents and shockwaves through the water to kind of try and force it up. Unknown to US ship Randolph is that this submarine has had no contact with the outside world for days. The last they heard was that, you know, we were potentially entering this Cold War, the nuclear war, sorry, and they haven't heard anything else. Communication's been blocked for some reason. So those on board genuinely fear and believe that nuclear war has happened. Now, the captain of the submarine wants to launch their nuclear torpedo in retaliation, and he is going to do it. And it's only because a more senior officer, who is actually this man up here, the one at the top, whose name is Vasily Arkhipov, is present, that he overrules the captain and essentially saves the world. Because if the Soviets had launched that nuclear torpedo, however unknowing to them, they would have caused a nuclear war because America would have retaliated. Now, on the same day, the Soviets shot down an American U-2 plane, killing this man. Now, he is Pilot Major Randolph Anderson, and he's one of the only people actually who are killed in this Cold War process in terms of directly between the USSR and America, not counting obviously people who died in Vietnam, things like that. The order to shoot the plane had been given by a lieutenant general in the absence of the commanding officer, but that again could have been responded to. Later the same day, another American plane is flying above Alaska and drifts into Soviet airspace. Now, the Soviets believe this is an international attempt to test how quickly they can respond to an attack, and they do fire anti-aircraft guns upon the plane, but the U-2 plane manages to escape. So in one day, we have 3 events which show how the world is on this knife edge. We have 2 U-2 planes, of which one is shot down and the pilot is killed, one escapes, and we almost have a submarine who shoots nuclear missiles at America. On the same day, so we're still on the 27th of October, Khrushchev sends a second letter to Kennedy, this time demanding that US missiles be removed from Turkey and Italy in exchange for them to remove their missiles from Cuba. Now, Kennedy does not want to be seen to give in to this. Khrushchev is obviously asking for more than he was originally. He also wants the missiles gone from Turkey and Italy, but Kennedy really feels by this point he has no choice but to accept it. He does force Khrushchev to make him a concession, and that concession is that the removal of these missiles in Turkey and Italy are kept secret. So as far as the public was concerned, it's Khrushchev's first letter that they're responding to, and that the missiles are finally removed from Cuba. Behind me, I've got a newspaper article that says Khrushchev offers to scrap Cuba bases. So to the world, finally, this crisis is now kind of over and done with. If you're interested, it's all depicted in a film called 13 Days. And it really is the moment where war, especially nuclear war, is the very, very closest we've ever had it. So the very last thing we have to do is just look at the consequences. Okay, I'm going to start with the results for the USSR. So this is Khrushchev here. We're going to go through him first. So his public claim was that he had agreed to peace, and he was the one that had agreed to remove the missiles in a desire for world peace. So he's trying to portray himself as an international hero as such. And I guess trying to create a slightly more positive reputation for communism and his leadership of the USSR. He also claims that he had protected the small and vulnerable nation of Cuba from the threat of American invasion. And he believes he showed the world, particularly South America, how the USSR would stand with other countries in the face of American aggression. Cuba remains communist and is reliant on the USSR for protection and financial aid. So that is good for them on a world stage. Extra countries being communist is always a positive thing. And it also results in the removal of missiles from Turkey and Italy that were threatening them in Europe. However, Khrushchev is unconvinced about Castro's reliability as an ally. He knows that in Castro's mind, Cuba comes before communism, and the shooting of the US plane shows the Cuban government can be unpredictable. So he's not sure how reliable this new ally is. Senior members of the Communist Party in Moscow are very unhappy about what happened, and they felt that Khrushchev had almost fought a nuclear war and that then he'd back down just when the USSR had had the advantage. So this is one of the key moments that really plays a role in Khrushchev losing power 2 years later in 1964. So he's ousted from the leadership. Kennedy, I'm going to do next. So Kennedy's right behind me. I'm going to have to sit in front of him though. So President Kennedy also publicly claimed victory in the Cuban Missile Crisis. After being criticized of weakness, he showed strength in standing up to the Soviet leadership and forcing Khrushchev to back down. He gains a reputation amongst the world leaders, and he silenced many critics who said he was being weak and inexperienced. He manages to successfully remove a major threat of war, and he gets the missiles removed from Cuba. Therefore, the USSR go back to not having any missiles within range of the mainland America. He's lucky, though, that the missile removal from Turkey and Italy is kept a secret, because if that had been publicized, it would likely have been seen as a failure and a retreat from Europe that they had promised to protect from communism, okay? But overall for Kennedy, in terms of a public sense, it's very, very positive. Okay, so the final thing I want to discuss is, was the world a safer place after the Cuban Missile Crisis? And I think fundamentally the answer is absolutely yes. First thing, in 1963, a hotline telephone link is established between Moscow and Washington, so they can have direct communication between both powers. This opens up the possibility for dialogue, and it means they don't have to guess and interpret each other's intentions anymore. It's proven successful in 1971 during the Indo-Pakistani War, where the telephone line is used for the first time successfully. The next thing, in 1963, same year, a nuclear test ban treaty is signed as a result of the crisis. The USA and the USSR pledged to discontinue detonating nuclear weapons in tests below water or above ground. So they're going to stop all testing of nuclear weapons. However, underground tests are still allowed, and France and China refuse to sign the treaty. So we do have some measure of a treaty. A couple of years later, in 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty is also signed, 5 years after the crisis, so in 1968. And this was designed to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons bases around the world. It was delayed, but still a direct result of missiles being placed in Cuba in 1962 to try and limit and shows more evidence of a limitation of nuclear weapons. The crisis on the whole led directly to recognition that superpower relations had to be improved, otherwise the world would be threatened again with the prospect of nuclear war, which is something which by this point both leaders, both countries wholeheartedly want to avoid.